The numbers coming out of the Strait of Hormuz right now are almost hard to believe. A 7-day rolling average of just 3.9 vessels transiting the entire waterway per day. Before this war started, that number sat around 130 ships a day, sometimes closer to 88 depending on which baseline you use. But either way, we're talking about a waterway that used to carry roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply and a fifth of its liquefied natural gas, now reduced to a level so low it barely registers as functioning maritime traffic at all. As of the most recent tracking data, the strait sits at somewhere between 2 and 4% of its normal capacity, with some days recording an average of 0 actual oil tankers making the crossing. This is the story of exactly how the world's single most important energy choke point went from carrying 20 million barrels of oil a day to functionally shutting down, and why the latest American move, cutting off the legal financial pipeline that let Iran sell its oil at all, might be the single decision that finally makes this collapse permanent, rather than just another temporary dip in an already brutal war. Picture the actual geography for a second, because it helps explain why a single narrow body of water can hold this much power over the entire global economy. At its narrowest point, the Strait of Hormuz measures barely 21 miles across, with the actual navigable shipping channels on either side of the traffic separation scheme narrowing down to just a couple of miles each. That's an extraordinarily tight funnel for the sheer volume of energy that has to pass through it every single day under normal conditions: crude oil tankers, liquefied natural gas carriers, container ships, all threading through a corridor so narrow that ships heading in opposite directions are frequently visible to each other with the naked eye. There is no meaningful alternative route. A handful of pipelines running overland through Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates can bypass the strait entirely for a portion of Gulf oil production, but nowhere near enough capacity exists in those pipelines to replace what normally flows through the water itself. When this specific choke point gets disrupted, there simply isn't a plan B sitting ready to absorb that volume, which is exactly why watching it collapse down to a 3.9 vessel daily average carries the kind of global economic weight that a disruption almost anywhere else on the planet simply couldn't replicate. Let's start with that specific move, because it's the freshest development and it's genuinely significant in a way that deserves careful unpacking. The United States Treasury Department formally announced it was revoking what had been known as General License X, the specific legal authorization that had permitted the production, delivery, and sale of Iranian crude oil, petrochemical products, and petroleum products under a memorandum of understanding signed back in June. In its place, the Treasury issued a new authorization, License X1, but this new version exists specifically to wind down and unwind whatever legal Iranian oil trade had been happening under the previous framework, not to continue it. Translation, in plain terms. The narrow legal channel that had allowed some Iranian oil to flow through officially sanctioned pathways just got closed, and it got closed specifically because of Iran's own earlier strikes on ships transiting the strait. That's the supply line getting cut, not metaphorically, but through an actual formal Treasury Department action, stripping away the legal mechanism Iran had been relying on to move its most important export commodity through anything resembling a normal, sanctioned pathway. It's worth understanding exactly how a mechanism like General License X actually functions within the broader architecture of American sanctions policy, because it's not simply a permission slip, it's an entire carve-out built into an otherwise sweeping set of restrictions. Sanctions regimes targeting a country's oil sector are usually written broadly enough to prohibit virtually any transaction involving that country's petroleum products, and specific licenses like this one exist to create narrow, carefully defined exceptions, allowing certain categories of trade to continue under close monitoring, rather than forcing every single transaction into a fully underground, completely unregulated black market. Revoking that exception doesn't just remove a convenience, it pushes the entire volume of trade that had been flowing through it back into exactly the kind of shadow banking, ghost fleet, and sanctions evasion networks that are far harder to track, far more expensive to operate through, and far more vulnerable to seizure and disruption at every single stage of the transaction. Let's rewind through the full timeline here, because understanding how we got to a nearly frozen strait requires walking through several distinct phases of escalation, each one chipping away a little more at whatever fragile shipping activity remained. This entire crisis traces back to February 28th, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated air war against Iran that killed the country's supreme leader and a significant portion of its senior leadership in the opening hours alone. Iran's retaliation was swift and specifically targeted the strait itself. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued explicit warnings forbidding passage through the waterway, began boarding and attacking merchant ships, and started laying naval mines directly in the shipping lanes. Within 48 hours of those opening strikes, the strait had effectively closed, with major shipping companies including Maersk, MSC, CMA CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd all suspending transits entirely. More than 150 tankers ended up anchored outside the strait rather than risk the crossing, sitting idle, burning through charter costs, waiting for a resolution that took months to even partially materialize. The United States responded to Iran's mine-laying campaign with direct military action, and one specific strike from that early period genuinely deserves its own spotlight. In mid-March, American forces destroyed 16 separate Iranian mine-laying vessels in a single operation near the strait, a strike Central Command described explicitly as necessary to prevent Iran from further disrupting one of the most critical maritime choke points on the planet. That single action tells you something important about the nature of this entire crisis from the very beginning. This wasn't primarily a story about missile duels and dramatic aerial combat, though there was plenty of that happening elsewhere throughout the war. At the strait itself, the core fight was about mines, about small boats, about the tedious, unglamorous work of either seeding a waterway with underwater explosives or systematically hunting down and destroying the vessels responsible for planting them. Naval mines are a genuinely fascinating weapon to think through in the context of a choke point this narrow, because they don't require anywhere near the technological sophistication of a cruise missile or a fighter jet to be enormously disruptive. A relatively small number of mines, scattered across a shipping lane only a couple of miles wide, can effectively shut down the entire waterway simply by making every single vessel captain and every insurance underwriter unwilling to risk the transit, regardless of how many mines have actually been cleared or how confident naval forces are in their own minesweeping capabilities. That's the core asymmetry sitting underneath this entire crisis. Iran doesn't need to physically sink dozens of ships to achieve its strategic goal of disrupting global shipping. It just needs enough uncertainty about where mines might still be hiding to make commercial operators and their insurers decide the risk simply isn't worth it, and that psychological effect can persist for weeks or months, even after the physical minesweeping operations have technically cleared a given stretch of water. By early April, a ceasefire took hold, mediated by Pakistan, and President Trump made the conditions of that ceasefire explicit in his own public statements, tying it directly to what he called the complete, immediate, and safe opening of the Strait of Hormuz. Some ships did start transiting again during that window, but Iran halted traffic once more in response to separate Israeli attacks happening in Lebanon at the time, showing just how tightly Iran had tied its own strait policy to completely unrelated fronts of a much broader regional conflict. When direct negotiations in Islamabad subsequently failed to produce a lasting agreement, Trump ordered a full American naval blockade of Iranian ports on April 13th, an operation specifically carved out to still allow humanitarian aid shipments through while blocking essentially everything else. Here's where the story takes a brief, cautiously hopeful turn, because by mid-June, the two sides actually managed to sign a memorandum of understanding, and traffic through the strait genuinely started reopening, toll-free starting around June 17th. It never fully returned to pre-war levels, but for a few weeks, the numbers were trending in a meaningfully positive direction, oil prices stabilizing somewhat, tankers cautiously resuming transits, the first real sign since February that this particular crisis might actually be finding some kind of resolution. That window didn't last. In early July, that agreement collapsed after fresh attacks on commercial vessels deemed by Iran to be non-compliant with its own demands about which specific routes ships were permitted to use through the strait. And the entire cycle of closures snapped right back into place, this time compounded by everything that had already been lost and degraded during the preceding months of conflict. Let's talk about exactly how severe the current numbers actually are, because the collapse we're seeing right now isn't just a return to the earlier closure, it's arguably worse. According to the most recent published tracking data, the strait sat at roughly 10 vessels transiting per day as of late July, a number that's since deteriorated even further down to that 3.9 vessel 7-day average we opened with some individual days recording essentially zero oil tankers crossing at all. Lloyd's List. Intelligence, one of the most authoritative sources for tracking global shipping movements, reported that no large vessel had crossed the strait via the American coordinated route, while broadcasting its actual location for an entire stretch of days, describing traceable crossings along the Oman hugging lane as effectively grinding to a complete halt. That phrase, grinding to a halt, is doing a lot of work there, because it's describing what's supposed to be one of the busiest, most economically vital waterways on the entire planet. Now, it's worth being honest about a genuine wrinkle in these numbers, because the picture isn't quite as absolute as the raw tracking data alone might suggest. Convoys are still moving through the strait under direct naval escort, and a meaningful number of tankers are reportedly transiting with their tracking systems deliberately switched off, meaning the true volume of oil actually moving through the waterway may be somewhat higher than what's visible in the public data. Insurance costs and route availability remain the binding constraints keeping most commercial shipping away entirely, since underwriting a vessel to sail through an active war zone with mines, missile strikes, and boarding parties as very real risks has become either prohibitively expensive or simply unavailable through normal channels. So even accounting for that undercount, the honest picture here is still one of a waterway operating at a small fraction of its normal capacity, propped up almost entirely by military escort, rather than functioning as anything resembling normal commercial shipping. Think about what it actually means for a ship captain to make the decision to switch off tracking equipment before entering a stretch of water this contested. Automatic identification systems exist specifically so that vessels can be tracked and identified in real time, both for basic maritime safety and for the kind of transparency that lets naval escorts, insurers, and port authorities all coordinate around a shared, verified picture of where every ship actually is. Going dark, deliberately disabling that system, is an admission that being visible has become more dangerous than being invisible, that the risk of getting targeted specifically because you're identifiable now outweighs the safety benefits of being trackable in the first place. That's a genuinely telling signal about how commercial shipping operators themselves are assessing the actual risk environment in the Strait right now, regardless of whatever official reopening negotiations happen to be occurring in parallel through diplomatic channels. Let's get into the broader blockade numbers too, because the American side of this equation has been just as active as the Iranian mining and harassment campaign. Central Command's most recently published figures show American forces have redirected 94 separate commercial vessels attempting to reach Iranian ports and disabled 4 more, all specifically enforcing the blockade meant to choke off the flow of commerce into and out of Iran entirely. Those numbers have been climbing steadily throughout the months this blockade has remained active, and each individual interception represents a real economic loss for Iran, cargo that never reaches its destination, revenue that never materializes, another data point reinforcing just how thoroughly Iran's maritime economy has been cut off from the rest of the world. Iran hasn't been sitting quietly through all of this either, and its response has taken on a genuinely fascinating legal dimension worth understanding in detail. Iranian officials have claimed, in what analysts have specifically described as an unprecedented assertion, that Iran holds the right to control shipping through the entirety of the strait, not just its own territorial waters. Tehran has pointed specifically to language buried in that June Memorandum of Understanding, where Iran agreed to make arrangements using its best efforts for the safe passage of commercial vessels, and has since interpreted that language as effectively granting it authority over the whole waterway rather than simply committing it to cooperative safety measures. Iran's parliament has taken that interpretation even further, currently reviewing legislation that would formally ban American, Israeli, and other so-called hostile state vessels from transiting the strait altogether, while simultaneously running a separate parallel set of talks with Oman specifically focused on defining which shipping corridors might eventually be considered approved under some future arrangement. Think about what that combination actually represents strategically. Iran is running 2 completely different tracks simultaneously, a legislative process specifically designed to provide legal cover for what could become an indefinite blockade if broader negotiations collapse entirely, alongside a genuinely separate diplomatic channel with Oman aimed at finding some kind of narrower, mutually acceptable arrangement. That's not indecision, that's a deliberate hedge, giving Iran's leadership the flexibility to either point to a signed international agreement if talks succeed, or fall back on domestic legislation providing justification for continued closure if they don't. And crucially, as of the most recent reporting, no reopening agreement has actually been signed, leaving the entire situation in exactly the kind of prolonged uncertainty that keeps oil markets on edge and keeps that legislative option sitting on the table as a very real possibility rather than empty political theater. Let's talk about what all of this uncertainty is actually doing to global energy markets right now, because the ripple effects extend far beyond just the immediate region. Analysts tracking the situation have pointed out that this legislative ambiguity, combined with the ongoing Iran-Oman talks producing no finalized deal, is specifically sustaining what's called market backwardation, essentially preventing oil prices from repricing downward the way they normally might once a crisis appears to be stabilizing, because nobody in the market actually knows whether a durable resolution is coming or whether the current near total closure simply continues indefinitely. Brent crude has already moved significantly higher through the summer months as inventories have dwindled and supply chains have come under sustained stress, with market analysts specifically flagging refined petroleum products rather than crude oil itself as facing the most severe pricing pressure, since refining capacity and distribution networks tend to be even more geographically concentrated and harder to reroute than raw crude supply. Here's where the story gets even more complicated, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't the only major maritime choke point under simultaneous pressure right now. Over in the Red Sea, the Houthi movement in Yemen has reignited its own long-running campaign against shipping, specifically targeting Saudi oil vessels in retaliation for Saudi airstrikes against an airport in Yemen's capital. Strikes the Houthis claim were connected to an Iranian official who had been traveling through the area. That ceasefire, which had held since 2022, has been genuinely tested since late July, with the Houthis formally announcing a blockade on Saudi oil vessels and following through with actual attacks on multiple tankers in the week since. So you've now got two of the most critical maritime corridors on the entire planet facing simultaneous disruption: the Strait of Hormuz, choked down to a bare trickle, and the Red Sea route toward Europe, which was already operating at less than half its pre-crisis capacity even before this latest flare-up, facing renewed attacks on top of everything it had already absorbed. Think about the compounding effect of having both of those corridors under pressure at the exact same time, because it removes exactly the kind of flexible rerouting options that normally help global shipping absorb a disruption in any single location. When one choke point gets disrupted, shipping companies can sometimes reroute around it, accepting longer transit times and higher fuel costs, but still keeping cargo moving. When two of the world's most important maritime corridors are simultaneously constrained, that flexibility essentially disappears, and the pressure just compounds directly onto global energy prices and supply chain reliability with nowhere left to redirect the strain. Consider what the alternative routing actually looks like in practice for a shipping company trying to move cargo from the Gulf toward European or Asian markets, while both of these corridors are compromised at once. Rerouting around the southern tip of Africa instead of using the Red Sea and Suez Canal route adds roughly 10 to 14 additional days of transit time depending on the specific origin and destination ports involved, along with substantially higher fuel costs and crew expenses for that extended voyage. Multiply that added cost and delay across the thousands of vessels that would normally rely on these two corridors under any random ordinary week, and you start to understand why economists tracking this crisis have specifically flagged it as the most severe supply chain disruption the shipping industry has faced in the modern era, worse in some specific respects than the pandemic era shipping crisis that generated so many headlines just a few years earlier, precisely because that earlier crisis never involved two major choke points being simultaneously constrained by active military conflict at the same time. Let's zoom out and think about the broader institutional response that's emerged specifically to try to manage this crisis, because it represents a genuinely novel development in how a choke point dispute like this gets handled, one that speaks to just how seriously the international community has come to treat the risk of a truly indefinite closure. In response to the ongoing chaos, a body called the Persian Gulf Strait Authority has been formed specifically to try to define and manage shipping corridors through the region, an attempt to create some kind of structured, internationally recognized framework for exactly which routes ships can safely use and under what conditions. President Trump, back in the earlier phases of this crisis, took the fairly unusual step of publicly urging other major nations, specifically naming China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom, to send their own naval vessels to help secure the strait, framing it explicitly as a shared international responsibility rather than something the United States alone should bear the burden of protecting, all while stating plainly that American forces would continue bombing the Iranian shoreline and targeting Iranian vessels and boats, regardless of whether other nations joined the effort or not. That's a genuinely interesting diplomatic posture worth sitting with for a moment. On one hand, actively soliciting international naval support for securing a shared global economic interest. On the other hand, simultaneously declaring unilateral intent to keep bombing Iran's coastline, whether other countries participate or not. It's coercive diplomacy layered on top of coalition building, an attempt to internationalize the cost and responsibility of keeping the strait open while retaining complete unilateral authority over how aggressively to actually punish Iran for closing it in the first place. Now let's think honestly about why Iran keeps returning to this exact strategy of closing or restricting the strait, despite watching it fail to produce lasting leverage over and over again throughout this entire war. Trump himself made a genuinely revealing comment about this dynamic back in mid-March, claiming the United States had already destroyed the entirety of Iran's conventional military capability, but pointing out that even a country that thoroughly defeated can still send a drone, drop a mine, or fire a single close-range missile somewhere along or inside that narrow waterway. That's exactly the asymmetric logic underpinning Iran's entire approach to the strait throughout this conflict. You don't need a functioning air force or a powerful navy to disrupt global oil markets when you control the coastline along the world's most important choke point. You just need enough mines, enough small boats, and enough willingness to accept devastating retaliation in exchange for genuinely global economic disruption. That's a trade Iran's leadership has apparently been willing to keep making again and again throughout this war, even as the retaliation for making it has grown progressively more severe with each cycle. Let's talk honestly about the human cost sitting underneath all of these economic and diplomatic headlines too, because it's easy to lose sight of amid all the shipping statistics and Treasury Department announcements. Across the full scope of this crisis, at least one tugboat has been sunk. More than 17 merchant ships have sustained damage, with as many as 7 of those getting fully abandoned by their crews. 2 separate merchant vessels have been outright captured. 12 seafarers have been killed or gone missing, and a port worker in Bahrain was killed, with 2 others wounded in strikes connected to this broader crisis. Those aren't abstract shipping delays. Those are real people, ordinary merchant sailors from countries all over the world with no direct stake in the underlying American-Iranian conflict, caught in the crossfire of a geopolitical struggle over control of a waterway. They were simply trying to cross for entirely routine commercial purposes. Merchant sailors on these routes typically come from a genuinely global pool of maritime labor, crews frequently drawn from the Philippines, India, Eastern Europe, and a dozen other countries with no meaningful connection to either side of this specific conflict, working aboard vessels flagged to yet another entirely different set of nations for shipping companies headquartered somewhere else again. That's the quiet, often overlooked reality of global maritime trade, an enormous, largely invisible workforce that keeps the entire system running. And it's exactly that workforce absorbing the direct physical risk every single time a mine detonates or a boarding party seizes a vessel in a waterway that's become this contested. Every statistic in this story, every percentage point of reduced traffic, every dollar of rising insurance premiums, ultimately traces back to real families waiting for word about a relative working a route that used to be considered routine and has now become one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the entire planet. Let's think through the specific significance of that Treasury license revocation one more time, because it's genuinely the freshest and arguably the most structurally important piece of this entire unfolding story. Throughout the earlier phases of this crisis, even during periods of active military conflict, there had still been some legal, sanctioned pathway for at least a portion of Iranian oil to move through recognized channels under that June Memorandum of Understanding. That pathway represented Iran's last remaining connection to anything resembling normal international commerce for its most important export commodity. Revoking it doesn't just add another layer of economic pressure on top of everything else, it closes off the specific mechanism that had been allowing Iran to claim, at least in some limited sense, that it still had a legitimate, internationally recognized route to sell its oil despite everything else happening around it. With that license gone and replaced by a wind-down authorization instead of a continuation, Iran's oil exports are now pushed entirely into the same gray and black market channels that countries facing the most severe sanctions regimes have historically had to rely on. Channels that come with steep discounts, unreliable buyers, and constant risk of further disruption or seizure. Here's the honesty check worth sitting with as we bring all of these threads together, because it would be a mistake to read this entire situation as simply a story of inevitable, one-directional collapse, without any genuine uncertainty left in how it plays out. Despite everything covered here, the mine-clearing operations, the blockade statistics, the license revocation, the parallel Iran-Oman talks, there's still an active diplomatic track running in the background that hasn't been fully extinguished. Those Oman-mediated conversations about defining approved shipping corridors represent a genuine, if narrow, pathway toward at least a partial reopening if both sides can find enough common ground to actually sign something durable. Markets holding in that state of backwardation, refusing to fully reprice downward, reflects real uncertainty about which direction this ultimately breaks, not a market that's already concluded the closure is permanent and irreversible. It's also worth remembering that this exact region has weathered serious maritime confrontations before and eventually found its way back to some semblance of normal shipping activity, most notably during the so-called tanker war phase of the Iran-Iraq conflict back in the 1980s, a period referenced explicitly in official government assessments of the current crisis precisely because of how closely the underlying dynamics rhyme with what's happening today. That historical precedent doesn't guarantee a similarly eventual resolution this time around. Every conflict carries its own unique variables, but it does offer at least some evidence that chokepoint crises of this magnitude, however severe they look in the moment, don't automatically translate into permanent, irreversible closures once the underlying political dispute eventually finds some kind of resolution. But even accounting for that genuine uncertainty, the structural trend line here is hard to read as anything other than deeply concerning for anyone hoping for a quick resolution. Every previous reopening this crisis has managed to produce. The brief April window, the more substantial June memorandum period, has eventually collapsed back into renewed closure, and each subsequent collapse has arrived alongside additional structural damage, more destroyed mine-laying vessels, more redirected and disabled ships, and now with this latest Treasury action, the removal of the very last legal economic pathway that had been keeping at least some formal connection between Iran's oil industry and the broader international financial system intact. That's not the pattern of a crisis trending toward resolution. That's the pattern of a crisis where each attempted fix has proven progressively more fragile than the one before it, while the underlying economic and military pressure driving the entire standoff just keeps compounding in the background, regardless of which specific diplomatic track happens to be active at any given moment. So where does this actually leave the global economy looking forward from here? with traffic sitting at somewhere between 2 and 4% of baseline capacity, with the Red Sea simultaneously constrained by renewed Houthi attacks, and with a legal pathway for Iranian oil exports now formally being wound down rather than continued, the pressure on global energy markets shows every sign of persisting well beyond whatever the next individual headline happens to be. Oil-consuming nations around the world, particularly those in Asia that have historically relied heavily on Gulf crude moving through exactly this waterway, are staring down a supply picture that looks nothing like the relatively stable energy markets the world had gotten used to before this entire conflict began back in February. And Iran, for its part, is staring down an economy increasingly cut off from its most important source of foreign currency at the exact moment its currency, its food supply, and its own domestic political stability are all already under severe compounding strain from every other direction imaginable. I want to know what you think happens next with this waterway that used to carry a fifth of the entire world's oil supply and now barely registers as functioning at all. Do you think the parallel Iran-Oman talks eventually produce a durable reopening agreement that finally sticks where every previous attempt has collapsed? Or do you think Iran's parliament actually passes that legislation, formalizing an indefinite blockade, essentially making the current near-total closure the new normal for the foreseeable future? Drop your thoughts down in the comments, because this is exactly the kind of slow-moving but genuinely world-altering economic story that deserves more attention than it typically gets buried underneath more dramatic military headlines. If this breakdown helped you understand just how close the world's most important energy choke point has come to a genuinely permanent collapse, go ahead and hit that like button. It honestly helps get detailed analysis like this in front of more people, trying to understand exactly why their gas prices and shipping costs keep climbing. And if you want to stay updated as this situation keeps evolving, whether that's a genuine breakthrough in the Oman talks or Iran's parliament formally locking in an indefinite closure, go ahead and subscribe, because this story is nowhere close to finished, and I'll be right here breaking down every new development the moment it happens. Thanks so much for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one.